Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar that's focused on the potential impacts on immigrant and English learner students of the Every Student Succeeds Act. My name is Margie McHugh, and I'm the Director of the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. And before we get going, I have a few housekeeping items to flag for you. As you can see on your screens, on our website, migrationpolicy.org, you'll be able to find slides and audio from today's webinar. Please give us an email, send us an email at events@migrationpolicy.org or call us at the number you see on the screen if you have any problems accessing the webinar. We have staff that are monitoring both that phone line and also the events email address. Please use the Q&A chat function. You should be able to see it on the right of your screen throughout the webinar. It would be great if you could send us questions early on in the webinar so that we can get ready to try and move through them during the Q&A period. It just always helps to get them as you're thinking of them and earlier on in the session. And also, you can either write them in that chat function or, again, use that events@migrationpolicy.org email address to send your questions. So as I said, I'll be moderating today's webinar and also taking a few minutes as we start to provide some setup for the conversation. And then the analysis of the law's key provisions will be covered by Delia Pompa, who's a Senior Fellow for Education Policy here at MPI. I'll introduce her more fully in a few minutes. In setting the context for today's discussion, I'll be drawing from some data resources and policy reports that have been produced by our center as part of our work focusing on education quality and access issues facing children from immigrant families. This work is part of core investments our center has made in studying education success issues for immigrants and their children across the education and skills training pipeline. Our work to support government agencies seeking to address language access requirements, and our work seeking better coordination of integration policy across the federal government, and also looking at the federal government working in better partnership with state and local governments, also intersects our education research, since very often many of the issues that need better coordination are actually in the education pipeline arena, or sorry, within the education pipeline across that range of issues. So if you'd like to find out more about any of those efforts, please feel free to email us. You'll see our email addresses on the final slide here, or just visit our website. I think you'll find it easy to navigate to find your way to some of those resources. So the first and most obvious contextual factors for today's conversation are the enormous growth of English learners in the U.S. in recent decades and their dispersion away from the 5 traditional immigrant gateway states of California, New York, Texas, Illinois, and Florida to states and local communities across the U.S. This map is from a fact sheet available through our ELL Information Center that you'll find on our website. It shows the share of English learner enrollment in K-12 schools by state, and you'll see there that it's drawn from the 2012-13 school year. So L's are 10 to 25% of student enrollment in the darkest colored states, 5 to 10% in the next lightest shade, and under 5% in the lightest color states. I thought it would be helpful to show the map just to drive home the point that truly immigration and English learner issues are no longer a 5-state issue. And also the map, I think, points to the number of states that have not been traditional immigrant and refugee destinations that have needed to build the capacities and systems necessary to equitably serve them. So you can see there's a lot of energy, I would say, looking at this map that has had to go on around the country in order to do a better job of serving English learner students. Here again, drawn from the fact sheet that I was just mentioning, you'll see the top 15 states with the highest EL student enrollment. It's no surprise that the top 5 states are the historic destinations of California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. And as you can see, their EL population is large both in number and in share, overall share of their students. You see then the new growth states such as Colorado, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, also with high numbers. And I should point out Nevada towards the bottom of the table with a particularly large share of ELs in their overall student population. And then moving to where the rubber truly hits the road, here are the top 15 school districts for EL enrollment. I believe the fact sheet on our website lists the top 25 school districts, but again here you can see the number and share of ELs with 8 of the school districts having a share of ELs that is 20% or higher. I've walked through these national to state and then district snapshots quickly, just partly to mirror how Delia will be speaking about the flow of policymaking and actions by the different levels of government as the new law is implemented, and also to give just a quick sense of how diverse the EL landscape is in terms of basic geography, not to mention many other differences that we don't have time to get into today. But before moving into Delia's presentation, I do want to make a few general points relevant to the current situation of ELs as ESSA is implemented. Drawing on a variety of research projects here at MPI, we know that a whopping 30% of young children under 5 in the United States are dual language learners, meaning that they come from a home environment where at least one of their primary caregivers speaks a language other than English at home. These children are inconsistently, even rarely, identified in early childhood program data, and their home and English learning needs are often not reflected in teacher training, certification, or program quality measures. We also know that there's very often a poor handoff to K-3 systems where the children's home language and English language learning needs are again often overlooked in policy and program approaches. And unfortunately, it's quite easy to see the effects of this in 3rd and 4th grade test scores. There are often large gaps in basic math and reading skills for EL, former EL, and Latino youth evident in those scores, and many see these as evidence of weaknesses in policy and instructional design for young dual language learners and English learners. Then looking very quickly at older English learners, and again drawing from research conducted by our center, in particular reports we produced on the educational experiences of young immigrant adults in California, Washington, and Georgia, we found that English learners arriving in secondary schools face significant challenges in acquiring academic proficiency in English and grade level content knowledge, and also that the challenges that are facing these long-term English learners, newcomer students, and other English learners are often inadequately addressed, which in turn leads to high dropout and low graduation rates for English learner and many immigrant youth. Thanks to the No Child Left Behind Act and its subgroup accountability provisions for English learners, we know a lot more now than we ever did in the past about the educational progress of EL students in U.S. schools, and many state policymakers and local educators have worked mightily to improve education for ELs across the country. While there's certainly good news to report in terms of the progress made in recent years for ELs, there are also many signs of uneven progress and challenges in meeting their needs. So it's with this sense of the map of ELs and their distribution across diverse geographies and systems across the country, and also the diverse strengths and weaknesses of local systems in meeting EL needs, that we're now entering into this new chapter in education policymaking in the U.S. And I'm just delighted to say that I couldn't have a better colleague, and we couldn't have someone better to be leading us through a conversation of what we're moving into, what we're leaving now from the NCLB era and moving into the ESSA era, than Delia Pompa. Delia has had a storied career in English language education and policymaking. She began as a bilingual classroom teacher in Texas, rose to be the head of bilingual and migrant ed for the Houston School District, then the head of these issues at the Texas Education Agency, and then the head of these issues also during the Clinton years at the U.S. Department of Education. Most recently, she has served as the Vice President for Programs at MCLR, but all through her time in I would say, the recent several decades, I'd have to say there's hardly been a conversation about EL policymaking that's happened in Washington, D.C. that she hasn't been a key resource to or leader of. So, Delia, I'm going to pass the baton to you now to walk us through the law's key provisions and how folks who are working at the state and local levels should think about their impacts.
Thank you, Margie, and good afternoon, everyone. As Margie said, I've been around a long time, so I thought it might be useful for me to begin the presentation by talking about ESEA's long history, the history of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which many of us view as a civil rights law, actually. And the law does have its roots in civil rights. This law came about just as a war on poverty, right after the war on poverty was coming into play. People were recognizing that many, many groups in this country did not have access to wealth, to education, to health. And ESEA was the first education law that recognized low-income children and minority children in some way. So as we look at the history of education for English learners and immigrant students, much of what we see that still survives in our schools and our districts in terms of policy is rooted in those civil rights, often in court orders, lawsuits, many of the processes you see that came through just the whole civil rights process. In around the 80s, I would say, as we started thinking as a country about school reform, those of us advocates for English learners, many of you on the phone with me, I know, began to see that the work we had done by championing the civil rights of these children wasn't working as well as it had before, just because of the changes in how things were taking place in Washington and across this country in terms of how politics were changing. And so we decided at that point that the way to make advances for immigrant and English learner children was to have a place at the table, to be part of every decision that was made in education. So those of you at the local level figured out that if you wanted the right textbooks, you needed to be on the textbook committee. Those people in Washington who figured out that we wanted good laws for English learners, we needed to be at the table while the overall law was being written, and we needed to have a voice in that overall law. And so we saw that change. We're now going into, I think, a third epoch. If I were a historian, I would say, and if I were writing a book, I would say we're in that third stage, which is devolution back to the states. We advocates for English learners have relied on federal protections for many, many decades, and we have benefited from those federal protections and those provisions in the law for many decades. But this particular law that we're going to talk about today begins to devolve some of those decisions and some of those policy-making processes and the authority back to the states. And I think if we were to talk about this law in a broad way and capture it in one sentence, I would say it was devolution of the authority and of many of the decisions to the states. And for that reason, it's important for us to talk about not just what the provisions are in this law, but also what the implications are for community stakeholders and what they are for people at the state level, because that is where the big decisions are going to be made, and that is where advocates and people who care about the education of these children need to be focusing their attention. So given that, let's talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the latest version of the ESEA, signed on December 10th. Just in general, what do we see in there that is important, that underlies everything we talk about? First of all, it was a grand compromise. As you know, for many, many, many years, we did not have a reauthorized law. Much of it was because of the lack of bipartisanship in the Congress, some would say. Many other issues sort of rose to the fore and maybe took over it was easier to deal with those issues than to deal with some of the very strongly held views on either side of the aisle in Congress. But this particular act does represent overcoming that through a great compromise. And that compromise, I think, signals that every side lost something and every side gained something. For those of us who work with English language learners, one of the hallmarks of No Child Left Behind was subgroup accountability, and the fact that for the first time, scores for English learners had to be broken out and looked at separately. The scores were disaggregated, and we were able to see, everyone was able to see how well these students were doing, not just how well the whole population was doing, and that was important to us. And that is maintained in this new act, and that's very, very important. A second piece that's maintained in this act is specifying that we should have English proficiency standards, that states need to have English proficiency standards, and that they need to be aligned with English language arts and math standards and other standards within the state. This is particularly important, I know, for many of you who worked very hard at the state level, excuse me, to make sure that the English proficiency standards you had were not only aligned, but they were research-based, and they moved kids in the right way when it came to learning in the classroom and the materials and what we demand of these students and how we expect that they will learn, and that continues to be in there. The other piece that is also in this act that was important to us all along is the annual assessment of English proficiency. That assessment of English proficiency is something that we'll see in a minute has moved to a very important place, but it's something that's important to all of us, along with assessment of English language arts and math. So moving on now, let's look at the more general provisions of ESSA. Because the provisions for English learners are nested within these broader provisions and have a great impact on what happens to English language learners. First of all, I talked earlier about the devolution to the states. Accountability systems for states used to be defined by the federal government under the old No Child Left Behind Act. Under ESSA, the states designed their own accountability systems. That, again, I think is important for us to remember as stakeholders, because that means any advocacy we do, any changes we want to make, any modifications, any way we want to champion the needs of our students, of English learners within the accountability system has to take place at the state level. And it means people who perhaps might not have been involved at the state level in policy making are going to need to sit up and look at what's happening in their state with regard to policies, general policies like accountability systems, because they will have impact on English language learners. A second general provision of ESSA is that the states must identify 5% in need of comprehensive support, schools in need of comprehensive support and improvement, and additional schools that have low-performing student subgroups. And they're defined as targeted support and improvement schools. Now, why is this important in this particular law? That is a reflection of the compromise. As you might remember, in the past, there was no limit to the number of schools that were identified as in need of improvement. What this provision does is say that the states must identify the lowest 5%, but as the compromise, it also says that if any other schools have consistently low-performing student subgroups, then they are also in need of targeted support and improvement, and the state needs to do something about that. A third general provision that has impact on all students and English language learners is the setting of limitations on the authority of the Secretary of Education. If you're interested in what those limitations are, I know you'll be able to read about them in many, many places. But what it means to us is, again, it's just a symbol of how much the authority has gone back to the states. We are in a period right now where we different groups are commenting on what the Department of Education needs to regulate on. What the Secretary of Education is able to regulate on is something we're all looking forward to seeing. So much of the law that some may feel needs clarification or expansion can happen perhaps if the Secretary of Education and others feel he has authority. It could not happen if there are limitations on the authority. So it's something we're still waiting to see. Moving forward, we're going to talk about major provisions in addition to the ones I talked about for English learners. It's important to note at this point, Margie alluded to the fact that we have a short amount of time and there's so much to talk about. So it's important to note that I'm only going to talk about 5 of the big provisions that I think have a great deal of impact for English learners and also impact at the state level where stakeholders and State Department of Education officials and local school officials need to come together. But there are other provisions that I'm not going to be talking about, and you can read about those. That there are laundry lists of the changes in a lot of different publications and in a lot of different places, and I hope you'll look at those. Some of the things that that I'm not going to talk about are very important to English learners. Margie talked about young dual language learners. There is a provision, there's a preschool grant program that could have great impact on our English learners. It's a provision I won't be talking about. In Title III, there's reporting out on students with disabilities. We're also looking at recognition of long-term English learners and recently arrived students in a different way than we have before. So there are many, many other provisions that I won't be talking about. But the provisions I will be talking about today are these that you see up here, having to do with, again, what the state will be doing. So English proficiency will now be included in state accountability systems in a way it hasn't before. There is an extension of former English learner inclusion in the subgroup that I'll talk about. Standardized entry-exit criteria is a huge change for many states that don't currently have standardized entry-exit criteria. There's a potential adjustment or possibility of an adjustment of how English learners are counted across the country. And then there's a new option for exempting English learner outcomes in accountability systems that I'll talk about also. So in looking at these provisions, I want to remind us that I'm going to talk about the provision itself, but I also want to talk about the implications, and I hope we'll get some questions about those implications, because this particular webinar, I hope, will lead you to think through what your role is in making sure these policies are implemented in the best way possible. And you will have much more of a role in the at the state level than you did previously. So we need to take advantage of that. So the first change, and it is a huge change for English learners, is that English proficiency outcomes are now to be included in state accountability systems. This is huge, as you know. English proficiency outcomes are one part of the set of academic indicators that the state has to identify. These academic indicators, right now in the law it says that they must count much more than other indicators than the state could and might identify. But having English proficiency in there with English language arts and math as part of the state accountability system, or how a state reports out its overall achievement, is a big, big thing for us. It means that there's a higher profile for how our English learners are doing. It means that in states with a large number of English language learners, you will be able to, we hope, set a good expectation that that indicator will have a large role in the overall system. That's something that we're waiting to see from regulation, how that will be set up, or how much the federal government can provide parameters for how these academic indicators are weighted. It is someplace that you could possibly, and hope you will, weigh in with your state in terms of looking at how much English proficiency will count within that indicator system. It is a very, very big possibility for raising the profile. There also is the risk that in states who don't have a lot of English learners, it won't be looked at in the same way. And so there is some role for advocacy and for talking about the needs of English learners. The goals are set by the state. Again, it changed. So the goals for English proficiency are set at the state level. I mentioned that is a potential subject for federal regulation or guidance. Something else that's important here is that English proficiency is now one of the indicators for school level ratings. So you see that impact at the school level and at the state level. So I began talking about what some of the implications are, but let's look at what the implications are for community stakeholders. It is more important than ever now that you understand your state's accountability system. And it is very possible, highly likely, that your state's accountability system will be changing now because of this law. Unless your state is very, very happy with what they've been doing, I would predict that there will be changes. And as someone in a school district, in a classroom, as an advocate in the community, it is important that you understand how that accountability system works and how English proficiency fits into that. The states are required to consult with the community, so another implication for all of us is that we be engaged in designing the new processes, that we are able to explore a voice. If we don't know how our voice is to be formally heard, then we figure that out so that we can have a voice in how that, how that accountability system will work for English learners. There are implications for the state also, and I think these are, this is a big implication that is signaled by the fact that English learners are part of the overall accountability system. It's signaled by the growth in the number of English learners, and it's signaled, I think, by just the changes our country is going through. And that is that the state needs to recognize that this requirement for including English proficiency is an opportunity to focus attention on English learners in a way that states might not have in the past. So many, many implications. If I were to say where would be the best place for you to start in getting engaged in this law in your state, it would be find out how your accountability system is going to work. The states have to implement that accountability system by 2017, 2018. There will be a lot of activity between now and then. I hope all of you will be engaged in not only expressing your opinion, but sharing your research and any experiences that you have related to English learners. So the next big, I keep clicking too much. I'm eager to talk about the implications, I think. The next big change is the expansion of the former English learner, not leaner, inclusion in the EL subgroup. What do we mean by that? I think most of you understand, but for those of you who are listening to this and have not been working with English learners before and were not familiar with the law, former English learners were not identified formally in the law. Through regulation, states could include former English learners when they had exited the English learner cohort. They could include their scores in the EL subgroup for up to 2 years. Proponents of this felt that it was a way to be able to show growth because once a student was exited, they no longer counted as an English learner, and so it was hard to see how the group was changing and improving. So the law now says that you may include former English learners for up to 4 years after they exit in with the English learner subgroup. The concern, this can be a very good change, but there also is a risk here. The concern is if you include former English learners for up to 4 years, there's a potential for masking the performance of English learners, of current English learners, And so that quickly moves us to the implications. It is important for us to communicate to everyone that we have to disaggregate outcomes for current English learners. Current English learners, when they're mixed with former English learners, you don't get a true picture of how the current kids are doing. And so while we want to be able to show that growth and include the former English learners, it's important that we know how the current kids are doing. Communicating that, perhaps giving examples from your own classroom, from your own school, becomes very, very important. But for the state, it's also important. It means that they need to be monitoring the performance of both current and former English learners. The groups are very different, and it's important that we understand how both groups are doing and how the groups are doing together. It is, as I said, a great opportunity to show growth and achievement in the population, but it also is fraught with the risk of not focusing on the current English learners sufficiently. That means the state not only has to monitor the performance of both, but it means it should be ready to intervene in response to poor outcomes as early as possible. One of the risks of the masking is that if the current group is not doing well, it may be masked and not uncovered for a while, and it's hard to intervene if you don't know how kids are doing. So that's something that as advocates, I hope you will be working with your state to make sure there is an ability to monitor both current and former English learners within your accountability system. So the next provision has to do with the standardized state entry and exit criteria. I think it is a huge step toward equity. Why do we think that? Why do I think that? As you may know, depending on the state you're in, many states do not have standardized entry-exit criteria within their state. So that means if you happen to be in one district, you may be identified as an English learner, but if you were in a district down the road, you might not be because there are different criteria. And so there are lots of implications of that. First of all, there's a basic equity concern, but it is hard to monitor kids. Our kids are very mobile. So you could be in a program one year, move to another district, not be in that program, and we were not, I believe by not having these standardized criteria, we were not able to, as a nation, monitor how our kids were doing well and ensure that they were going to get the services that they needed. It does affect a significant number of states who don't have standardized entry-exit criteria. I hope that through this, we will address the issues of mobility and accountability and be able to be held accountable for kids no matter where they are. We've talked about kids who live in different zip codes not having different standards. This is akin to that. We really need to make sure that we have, at least within the state, a notion of who our English learners are. This may have historical implications in that many states' entry and exit criteria were set through court order in the civil rights days. Many states have their criteria set in state law, developed in state law. So changing this, if necessary, may mean changes in state law. It may mean looking at old agreements and sort of addressing how one is going to standardize those across the board. So I think there's going to be a lot of activity in this area as the states start figuring out how we standardize that. Implications, I think there are several. Again, click on the draw there. First of all, for community stakeholders, it's important that you understand right now the range of entry exit criteria within your state. If you are a state that has different entry-exit criteria, which ones are they? What district has what? You know, how are you looking at kids? To begin to think through what you think are the appropriate criteria for your state. Again, these are going to be set by state, not by the federal government, so they're going to be different perhaps within the 50 states. And I do think, based on all the research we have and what we know about English learners and about their language development, There's a fair amount of overlap among the procedures and criteria for identifying kids and for reclassifying them, but it's not totally aligned. So, and it's going to be, I do think that there's some room for changes with across states just because of the different populations that are served and the history and many, many other things. So as a stakeholder, understanding what that means for your state and what is there now is very, very important. For the state itself, there are many implications. I mean, first of all, I think it's important that states begin to identify best practices in identification and reclassification and figure out not only what's important from an evidence-based perspective, but also what's appropriate for a state needs. Again, I said, you know, you might have different kinds of English learners in other states. You might have many more recently arrived students. All of that makes a difference. The states also need to actively seek input from stakeholders because I believe there's going to be a great deal of passion about this. I think states who don't have standardized entry-exit criteria are probably very tied to the system they have. So it is going to be important for states to seek input from their stakeholders to figure out what the temperature is among stakeholders and among districts and school personnel and figure out what is best for the entire state. And again, because of what I said, the historical context, it is important that the state review their current state laws and any court rulings that exist in that state that may affect the criteria. Moving on to a next big provision, and that is how English learners are counted. This is something that will be decided by the federal government, and many of you have very strong opinions about this. In the former law, the No Child Left Behind, the count could be determined either by the state count or from the American Community Survey. Those still are possibilities, but there now is also a possibility of a blend of those. So there are a lot of implications for funding, and there's some accountability decisions that could come out of here because depending on how the federal government defines how you count learners, those counts may go up or down in some states and have a great deal of impact on funding and, again, on some accountability decisions. So it's important to look at that. The implications of that are kind of obvious. It is important for community stakeholders to understand the optimal method for their state and to be able to give that input to the state and to the federal government as they're making their decision about how they're going to do that. From a state perspective, figuring out what is going to be the best way to count English learners across the country is informed by being able to model results of each method, to say this is what would happen if you did this is what would happen if you did that. We're either hurt by this, we're helped by that. It is important to communicate this preference to federal officials so that you can have a voice as local community or the state in how these kids are counted. I am moving on. My clicking finger seems to be broken. We're going to move to the final provision, which is a new option for exclusion of English learner outcomes and accountability systems. This one, I want to be careful that I address very well and very thoroughly because there has been some confusion, I think, even in some of the material we put out. Perhaps there was lack of clarity, and I want to make sure that we talk about this well. First of all, let's talk about what the option for exclusion of English learners in accountability, English learner outcomes in accountability systems does. It does address validity issues. Many of you have been concerned that English learners are tested and included in accountability provisions too early. It has implications for test administration requirements and when kids are tested. So what are those choices? And it's important that we look at these, as I said, very carefully. There are two options for exclusion. Now, I am reminded that the third option, which is not listed as an option because it is what goes along for everyone, is you can just count those kids like you do everyone else and just assess them right away and include them in the accountability system. But since the regulations in regulations for No Child Left Behind allowed that we exclude English learners from one administration of the language arts test the first year in school, and could exclude them from accountability systems for any or all of the assessments for 1 year. We think of that as the first option. That is what we've had under No Child Left Behind, the possibility of doing that. This law adds a second possibility or second option to just including them like with anyone else, and that is that you could assess these kids, or English learners, the first year. You would assess them on English language arts and math and report on them, but not count them in the accountability system the first year. But the second year, you would include those scores in the accountability system by using some sort of growth process. By using a growth process. So you would have the scores from the first year, that you would administer the assessments. You would not include them in the accountability system the first year, but you would just report them out. The second year, the students are in there, you would include them in the accountability system, and it would be based on growth from first year to second year. In the third year, you would do it just like you do for all other kids. So that is a new option. So the differences in the options are the first year, you just exclude from administration and from the accountability system. The second year, you start, you go back to what you do for all kids. The other option is to not exclude in the first year, assess them, but only report on it and not include in the accountability system. And the second year, include the scores in the accountability system and have a measure of growth from the first year. What are the implications of this? Lots of them, and I would be hard-pressed to say that I know what's best for kids in your state. I think this is where it's very important that at the state level, you understand what you think would benefit your English learners best and understand how each option would work, and be able to voice that opinion and concern and back that up with data and information. For the states, the implications are many. One is they also need to understand how English learners would benefit from each option, and they need to understand how exercising either one of those two options would interact with the state's overall accountability system. So there are implications depending on what the state's overall accountability system looks like. And finally, I think an implication for the state is that they need to consult with stakeholders, because I know that you all have very firm opinions about this that you will want to share. So where are we? Where are we going? The next steps. What can you do as a stakeholder? What should the state be doing? I think all the states right now are looking at how their accountability systems are going to change. For those of you who are champions of English learners, educators of English learners, if you don't already have relationships with state education agency staff, I would say you need to establish them now, because there are going to be many, many decisions made at the state level about accountability overall and about policies that affect English learners. Through that process of establishing the relationships, I recommend that you determine what your state process is going to be and what the timeline is going to be for developing state accountability plans. Within that timeline, where is there a consultation process? Where is the state seeking input? What information do you think your state needs to make these decisions, and do you think it's important to share? You need to know the issues. So in closing, I want to say that there are many, many opportunities in this law for English learners. There are many, many opportunities for us adults who work with English learners to ensure that the best is happening for our English learners from a policy perspective and from a practice perspective, but that we need to understand the issues, we need to communicate what we think is important in our state, and then we need to work to make sure that people understand the importance of English learners within our entire policy system. Thank you. I'm going to turn that back to, I believe, Margie, who's going to handle questions.
Yes, great. Thank you, Delia. And gosh, I'm a little bit afraid to say send in more questions because we have so many of them already. But definitely feel free to send in more questions if you have them. You can see there on the screen the various ways to send them to us. So Delia, good stamina there. Thanks for all that great information. I've tried to group some of the questions that came in. So I think to start, I'll give you two of the questions. One was, for federal accountability, is there any requirement to report how current ELs are doing, or is the requirement that accountability is based on the aggregate of both groups? And
actually, current isn't used. What it says, there is a requirement to report on English learners. What the law gives the option of to the states is including former English learners in that subgroup. So the law doesn't specify current or former, but it does say, it just says you report on English learners. But as a state, you can define that English learner group and whether you include former English learners, and then for how long you include them, up to 4 years.
Great. And then another question was, does the expansion of the subgroup mean that ELL teachers will be required to monitor students for 4 years instead of 2 years after exiting programs?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that question implies that in some state or district that it's the teachers who monitor them. Someone needs to monitor them. I don't know who it is. It's different in each district, in each state. But it says you can, if you decide you're going to include them for up to 4 years, and the implication is, and you know I shouldn't be so certain about it, but the implication is that you would monitor them for up to 4 years after.
Okay.
Maybe a good question to ask, to write in the comment period and ask about. I assume that that's the case, just from the way it's worded.
Okay, so speaking of that, about writing in the comment period, what are, you had mentioned early on that the department was still trying to figure out what issues they might conduct rulemaking around. So could you say a little bit more about what issues are in play there, and is there some role that that stakeholders should be thinking of trying to hurry up and play related to issues at stake there?
Well, I can't speak for the department. I can tell you what I know now, and I'll tell you why I say I can't speak for the department. The department has held a couple of hearings asking about what different stakeholders think should be regulated, and then they're asking for comments that need to be turned in by today. I believe it's 5 p.m. Eastern, I believe. I don't hold me to that. So there's an opportunity for written comment on what should be regulated. I don't know if they'll continue seeking input after that, or if it's officially closed off. I would guess that it can't hurt to express your opinion if you can't get it in by today. But this is not about regulations themselves. This is about what people think there should be regulations or additional guidance, you know, or technical assistance about.
Got it. Okay, then turning to a few of the kind of, I guess, mixed civil rights issues or civil rights jurisdiction issues. One question was, does the devolution of power under ESSA to states undercut the federal leverage that was implied in the January 2015 Dear Colleague letter that Department of Ed and Justice sent out?
It would be hard for me to express an opinion about that because I don't work in the department, and I can't. I do not believe that there is an intent to undermine the federal protections that are there and always have been for English learners, the basic federal protections. And to the extent that that guidance dealt with those, these kids are still protected under Title VI. So I think that, you know, I'm not a lawyer and you shouldn't quote me, but I would think from my experiences those protections supersede, but there is room for the states to develop policies around accountability different from what the federal government might have, or you know, make decisions about practice or make decisions in a different way than they have before. But it does not mean that those federal protections for basic civil rights are gone for English learners.
Okay. And then, Delia, there were two questions related to, I think, related to this, and then what we were just saying, and also just translation and interpretation more specifically. So, is there any requirement for a minimal level of communication with parents of ELs in the law, or are there requirements that schools provide any particular level of translation and interpretation for homeschool communication? So, sort of the same question about translation and interpretation.
Many of the provisions for parent engagement, parent notification are still there from the law. You know, whether the students were identified as English learners, you know, what their level of proficiency is, what method of instruction is going to be used. That's for English learners, you know, how the program is going to meet their needs. In terms of designing the accountability system, there is a general provision for consultation with stakeholders by the state, but it's not defined very, very specifically. Okay.
So, so I think given the number of questions that that have come in about the state choice, and you know, one of the questions was just, can you please go back over that again? But I think there were a good number of questions related to state choice, including things like, you know, when you say first year, is it first year in the country or in the district? I think it just might be worth it if you could go back over the options there under state's choice.
Okay, and I want to do this very carefully, and I hope my friends at the department will correct me if they see a different interpretation of this, but I believe the law says, I don't have it in front of me, it's the first year in U.S. public schools. I know there has been some difference people have interpreted that as, well, it's the first year in a district or it's the first year in my school. It's general. I do hope there'll be some guidance about that, because I think there still is some question about that, or there is some practice about that. So it would be good if we could be clear about what we mean by first year. My interpretation is the first year the student is enrolled is what the law says, and that's enrolled, from my interpretation, in U.S. schools. But I understand that different states and localities have interpreted that differently, and I do hope there'll be some guidance, and I hope you will ask for that guidance. So that's what I mean by first year. So what happens the first year is, again, you could not do anything special for those kids. That's not an option. That is the fallback, that you do the same thing you do for everyone. Option one, which has been in there before, is that you exclude those kids from assessment in English language arts. You had to assess them in math, as I recall. In English proficiency, you had to assess, but those were not counted in accountability systems for the first year. And then the second year, you would go back to, they were just tested and included in accountability systems like everyone else. The second option mirrors what I believe Florida is using, and that is that you would assess the kids in the first year they're enrolled, but you wouldn't include those results in the accountability system. You would just report them out. And then in the second year, when you assess for the second time because they were assessed the first year, then you could compare growth on them from the scores from the first year to the second year, and you could include that in your accountability system. For states that have a growth system, that might be a really easy thing to do. I don't know how states are going to decide how they do it. I think it depends on how, how states are going to decide what they choose to do. I think it is going to have a lot to do with what their overall accountability system looks like. I hope that was clear.
Great. Well, you know, also I should say to everyone on the phone that some of you have pretty specific questions about things for your states, and normally what we do after these webinars is just divide up the questions and make sure we answer all of them. So we'll try and get to all of them, and otherwise, you know, we'll be in touch on email afterwards. So Delia, there are two questions related to ELs with disabilities. Will there be more guidance on exit criteria for ELs with disabilities? And in Illinois, for example, there's an alternative assessment for ELs with severe disabilities. Would there be an option to exclude these students from accountability, basically?
The answer to that is I don't know. I don't think so. I think there probably is a need for more guidance. I've heard a lot of questions about kids with disabilities. There is a requirement that their scores be disaggregated when they're reporting out English proficiency under Title III, but it doesn't say anything else. I think the questions you ask are questions other people have had, but the law doesn't address that specifically.
Okay. And then there are a few questions about use of native language assessments. Could you maybe just say generally the extent to which native language assessments are addressed?
That hasn't changed from what was there before in the law. You can use native language assessments as an accommodation for students who have been in this country for fewer than 3 consecutive years, and that's provided for in current law. Great.
And then I know I know you were saying that that people really had to dig in on their own, you know, their own state issues in terms of figuring out which way of counting ELs made most sense for them. But there have been so many questions about it. Like, is there anything you could say maybe about how does somebody learn to figure out which method of counting would help or hurt in their state?
Well, I mean, one of the things you would have to do is have someone actually run the numbers. What would you report out as a state based on the number of kids you assess, and then what does the American Community Survey recognize as a number of English learners in your state? I believe there was a National Research Council paper a few years back on research in bilingual education, and they addressed this issue. I will try and find out the exact title, and we can post it on the website. I mean, I think that discussed the issue, but I don't believe it came down on either side. But in answer to your question, you would just have to actually compare the numbers and figure out a way to model those numbers. And I don't know how you blend the numbers. That's the option. But I'm not sure myself what that would look like from a sort of numerical or math sense.
Right, and it would be fair to say, I think that we're going to be looking at a number of these key issues here and trying to get some of that information out to folks as it becomes clearer. So Delia, I think this is a more more general question. That's a good one to end on, and basically the author of the question is saying that that it seems, or would we agree, that professional development under ESSA, that it would be important to have it be required or at least prioritized for all content area teachers, not just EL teachers, and if so, what role could community organizations play, both in seeking that, or what are some of the levers, I guess, for expanding the sort of professional development that's needed here?
I think the biggest lever is actually making the case for your own state from the standpoint of numbers of these teachers and experience to the extent that you have it, numbers of teachers who actually teach English learners who aren't trained. There are provisions in the law to use funds to train those teachers. So the law doesn't say you have to do it. I do think that the way to get it done is to be able to show from real life what impact that would have in your own state or your own community in terms of changing the training teachers currently get and comparing it to what their needs are. And that, I think there have been a lot of studies done about that and, going to look at them. And but I do think the most valuable way to do it is to look at your own district and present numbers to people who are considering the options to just explain what the need is and have testimony from teachers themselves. Great.
So, so everyone, you can see our email addresses up there on the final screen. There were a few questions that came in asking about what sort of national resources could people look to, how to be ready for different moments as implementation unfolds, and then also a whole lot of very specific questions about issues in your states and districts. So we will look carefully at all the questions that came in and get to answering all of them to the best of our ability. But I would also encourage all of you to be in touch with us and give us a little bit of guidance about what would be helpful to you as you move forward in your work and preparing for the implementation of the law, because with Delia on board here now at MPI as such a fantastic resource, we are trying to figure out how to organize our